On the morning of November 4th, 2010, 440 passengers and 29 crew boarded a Qantas Airways Airbus A380 at Singapore's Changi airport. The flight had originated in London and was stopping over at Singapore for 2 hours to refuel. Its final destination was Sydney in Australia. The journey to Sydney was due to take about 7.5 hours, but on this day, the massive airliner and its nearly 500 occupants would barely make it past Singapore. The aircraft being used for this flight was just 2 years old. In fact, it was the first of 6 A380s to be delivered to Qantas. The A380 is the largest passenger aircraft ever built. At this time, it was the most technologically advanced airliner in the skies, and its onboard systems had a tremendous level of redundancy. Banks of computers were connected to thousands of sensors all over the aircraft, which fed the pilots real-time information about the plane's condition. Though still new in 2010, the aircraft was beginning to prove itself as a highly safe and reliable passenger carrier. But the events which were about to unfold on this day would cast serious doubts on one crucial aspect of the plane's construction. In the flight deck on this morning was a rather unusual constellation of pilots. The A380 is normally flown by a crew of 2, a captain and a first officer. But on this day, there were 5 pilots in the cockpit. As well as the captain and first officer, there was a second officer who was due to take over during the flight to let the other pilots rest. There was also a check captain under training, and supervising him was a supervising check captain. The role of a check captain is to periodically assess the performance of the flight crew members to ensure that they are up to standard. Today, the captain was being assessed. That captain was Richard de Crespigny, who was sitting in the left-hand seat. At 53 years old, he was highly experienced, having accumulated over 15,000 hours of flying time. He had started his career with the Australian Air Force, where he served for 11 years. He left the Air Force in the mid-1980s, started a computer software company while the airline industry wasn't hiring, and then joined Qantas in the late 80s, where he spent much of his time flying 747s and A330s. He then trained to fly the A380 in 2008. At this time, he was still rather new to the aircraft, however, given that the aircraft itself was quite new. Second in command was First Officer Matt Hicks. Hicks was also highly experienced, and actually had over twice as many hours flying the A380 as the captain, with over 1,200 hours on the type. He had over 11,000 flying hours in total, in a wide variety of aircraft, including the Boeing 747, 767, and the Airbus A330 and A340. While it might seem that having more pilots on board should improve safety, this is not necessarily the case. Both the check captain in training and the supervising check captain had logged more flying time than the captain himself. In these situations, it is not uncommon for confusion to emerge over who is actually in charge, especially in an emergency. To mitigate this risk, the captain made it clear at the outset of the flight that the chain of command would be the same as if this were any other flight, with the captain in charge, the first officer as second in command, and the other crew members third. Given what was about to happen on this day, this kind of crew resource management would end up being crucial. At around 9:45 that morning, having been filled with 106 tons of fuel, the massive aircraft pushed back from the gate at Singapore, and the 440 passengers settled in for the flight to Sydney. At 9:56 a.m, the captain lined the aircraft up on runway 20 centre and pushed the 4 Rolls-Royce engines to takeoff power. For a few short minutes after takeoff, everything went to plan. The crew retracted the landing gear and the flaps as the aircraft climbed out over the Singapore Strait. During this time, it accelerated to 250 knots, or about 460 kilometers per hour. However, as the plane passed through 7,000 feet, it was shook by 2 loud bangs. Engine number 2, the inboard engine on the plane's left-hand side, had exploded. Metallic shrapnel was catapulted faster than the speed of sound out through the engine casing. It then shot directly through the left wing and fuselage. Immediately, jet fuel began gushing out from under that wing, right beside the red-hot engine. If it caught fire, it would spell disaster for everyone on board. Straight away, the captain pressed the altitude hold button on the autopilot, which stopped the plane's climb. At this point, all the pilots knew was that something had happened to engine number 2. They had no idea yet of the extent of the damage which the engine had caused to the rest of the aircraft. What the crew didn't know was that when the searing hot shards of metal had exploded out from the engine, they penetrated the aircraft's fuselage in one of the worst places possible. As they travelled through the fuselage at supersonic speeds, they severed bundles of electrical wiring which fed a number of aircraft systems, including the flight controls, electrical power, fire protection, hydraulic power, and more. In all, about 650 wires had been cut. The captain assured his colleagues that he had the aircraft under control, and instructed the first officer to begin working through the checklists which were now displaying on the ECAM, or Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor, which is the central display in front of the pilots. The atmosphere in the cockpit was calm but focused, but the crew quickly realised that this was no ordinary engine failure. The ECAM had started to display warning messages for systems which had nothing to do with the engines. Something had clearly gone badly wrong. Unlike the pilots, the passengers sitting on the left-hand side of the aircraft had a front row seat to what had gone wrong. They could see holes in the wing, which had been punched by the engine shrapnel. They could also see fuel gushing out from underneath the wing and streaming back from the aircraft. Back in the cockpit, the signs of this damage were beginning to emerge. The first burst of warnings the crew got related to the engine itself. The ECAM displayed messages saying that the engine 2 turbine was overheating, and that the engine had stalled, along with a number of other related messages. In reality, the engine turbine was all but obliterated. These warnings merely hinted at the damage that had been done. The crew shut down the engine and alerted air traffic control to their predicament. Concerned that the engine may have caught fire, the pilots discharged one of the engine's 2 fire extinguisher bottles. However, worryingly, they received no confirmation that the bottle had been discharged. They repeated the procedure, but again, no confirmation came. The crew discussed this and decided that it would be best to try the second bottle. They fired it, and again, there was no sign that anything had happened. Unbeknownst to them, one of the systems which had been cut off by the engine explosion was the engine's fire suppression system. With gallons of jet fuel streaming out from a hole in the wing beside the engine, the last thing they needed was an engine fire. Their situation was now critical. Meanwhile, on the island of Batam, just south of Singapore, large pieces of engine debris had started raining down from the sky. One piece crashed through the roof of a school, while others damaged houses and cars. The Qantas logo was visible on some of the wreckage, and some Batam residents began tweeting that a Qantas aircraft had crashed. News stations began showing footage of the engine debris, all while the crippled aircraft circled overhead. The Qantas share price started to collapse, as fear spread that one of their planes had crashed. Back in the aircraft, the pilots knew none of this. They were too busy dealing with the very real threat that they may not make it back to Singapore. The cockpit was filled with alarm bells and warning messages. The first officer continued to cancel these warnings, using the push button in front of him, as he methodically worked his way through the checklist items. This was an unprecedented emergency. Never had an Airbus A380 experienced such a complex and grave set of failures. All the way over in Sydney, at Qantas headquarters, the warning messages experienced by the pilots were being automatically relayed to the airline. However, nobody there could contact the crew. The engine shrapnel had cut off the plane's satellite communication system. The pilots were on their own. Even with all of his experience, the first officer was at his limit as he worked through the dozens of warning messages which had appeared on the screen in front of him. With the help of his colleagues, he had to decide which warnings to prioritise and which to ignore. Worryingly, it appeared that Engine 2 was not the only one which had been damaged. In fact, none of the 3 remaining engines were operating normally. Engine number 1 and 4, the 2 outboard engines, had reverted to what's known as a degraded mode, meaning that some engine parameters were not available to the pilots. Engine number 3, meanwhile, was in what is known as an alternate mode, although it appeared to be in better condition than the other two engines. This uncertainty created unease among the pilots. Without knowing how the remaining engines were working, there was a chance that they had been damaged by the explosion, but that this was simply not being detected by the computers. The last thing the crew wanted was for another engine to fail, or for multiple engines to fail, before they could make it back to Singapore. They still had dozens of warning messages to get through, and many more procedures to carry out. This meant that the pilots were now faced with a tough decision: to make an immediate return to Singapore, or to spend more time troubleshooting their problems out over the ocean. Neither choice was without significant risk. The 5 crew members had to carefully weigh up their options. If they spent more time trying to assess the damage in the air, they risked further damage being done to the plane, either by loss of fuel, hydraulic fluid, or electrical systems. In other words, the aircraft was controllable now, but how long would it remain that way? Would it be foolish to spend precious minutes up in the air when they could bring it into land right now? On the other hand, if they decided to land now, there was no telling how the aircraft would behave as it got lower and slower during the approach. The pilots were still working their way through the over 100 messages that had appeared in the cockpit. They were still assessing the damage. Which systems were available to them, and which were not? Were the flaps working? Were the brakes working? Would the landing gear extend when they wanted it to? These were vital questions to answer, and the pilots would have to answer them before they landed. In the end, the captain decided that the risks of returning immediately were greater than the risks of troubleshooting for longer. At least for now, the plane was controllable, and there was plenty of fuel on board. He wanted to hold off on returning to Singapore until he had a better idea of what he was dealing with. The crew advised air traffic control that they would need about 30 minutes to go through the ECAM messages and associated procedures, and asked to enter a holding pattern somewhere to do this. The captain was eager to stay within gliding distance of Singapore in case more engines failed, so the crew relayed this request to the controller. The controller at Singapore cleared them to hold out over the ocean to the east of Singapore, within a few miles of the airport. He then informed the flight crew that a number of aircraft components had been found by residents of the island of Batam in Indonesia. This came as a shock to the pilots. It was the first time their minds were brought outside the aircraft since the emergency began. Nonetheless, they couldn't concern themselves with this yet. The captain entered a holding pattern at 7,400 feet out over the sea, and the crew got to work diagnosing the aircraft's problems. By building up an accurate picture of the damage done to the aircraft, they would give themselves the best possible chance of a safe return to Singapore. The captain and check captain made a number of announcements to the passengers, informing them of this plan, and of their intention to return to Singapore once they had figured out what was wrong with the aircraft. They also reassured the passengers that they had been trained to handle such emergencies. But the truth was that this scenario had not been trained for. The shrapnel which tore through the plane caused substantial and complex damage to critical systems, which the pilots were only beginning to grapple with. After dealing with a series of warnings about the engines, the next avalanche of messages the crew were faced with regarded the aircraft's hydraulic systems. The flight controls of the Airbus A380 are powered by a combination of electrical motors and hydraulic actuators, while the landing gear and the brakes are hydraulically powered. The pilots received indications that one of the plane's 2 hydraulic systems, known as the green system, was losing all of its fluid. This was a clue to the pilots that they were dealing with something a lot more serious than a normal engine failure. Without a functioning green hydraulic system, the flight controls would be sluggish, and as they got close to landing, the pilots would have to let the landing gear extend by the force of gravity alone. As well as powering the gear, the green hydraulic system also powers the slats at the front of the wing. The slats are extended as the plane comes in to land in order to provide additional lift so that the plane can fly slower. Without functioning slats, the pilots would have to land a lot faster than normal. And, with reduced braking power as a result of the inoperative engine and the falling hydraulic pressure, it was beginning to look uncertain whether the plane would even be able to stop on the runway. The pilots were dealing with a crippled aircraft which apparently could neither stay in the air for very long nor stop once it reached the ground. To make matters worse, engine number 3, the only trusty engine left, was the only one providing hydraulic power to the only working hydraulic system, the yellow hydraulic system. If this failed too, the pilots would truly be in dire straits. However, even in an aircraft as advanced as the A380, there is only so much that the instruments can tell the pilots. They decided that to get a better idea of what was really happening, they should take a look at the damage for themselves. The second officer left the cockpit and went into the passenger cabin to inspect the damage. As he made his way through the cabin's upper deck, a passenger who was also a pilot for Qantas brought his attention to the screen in the seat back in front of him. The A380 has a CCTV camera mounted on its tail, which passengers can tune into on their screens. There, on the screen in front of him, was a view of the plane from the tail camera, which showed gallons of what looked like fuel streaming from the left wing. At this point, it wasn't clear whether the fluid was hydraulic fluid or jet fuel. The second officer then went downstairs to the lower deck of the aircraft to get a closer look at the damage to the wing. As he got closer, he could see that the trail of fluid was massive. It was about a half a metre thick, and it was coming from the underside of the wing, in the area of the number 2 engine. He also noted that the turbine area at the back of the number 2 engine appeared to have been completely blown off. He returned to the cockpit to report his findings back to the other pilots. In light of the sheer volume of fuel the second officer saw leaking from the wing, the pilots decided not to transfer any fuel into the leaking tank. The ECAM was telling them to transfer fuel, but the combined experience of the pilots on this flight allowed them to see that this would not be a safe option. There were many similar warnings they received, where they had to use their experience to decide either to follow the ECAM or to reject it. This was the ultimate test of their skills and, given the stakes, of their ability to work under stress. Behind them, the 440 passengers could do nothing but wait and hope that the crew were making the right decisions. Under normal circumstances, the pilots would have wanted to dump fuel at this point. Given the weight of their aircraft and the degraded flight controls and braking performance, they wanted to be as light as possible for landing. However, the explosion had damaged the aircraft's fuel management system, which meant that they were unable to dump fuel. As a result, they would be 50 tons overweight for landing. And what's more, the plane was now becoming lopsided. The significant fuel loss from the left-hand wing had meant that the wing was now almost 10 tons lighter than the right-hand wing. And this imbalance was increasing with every passing minute. The longer the crew spent in the air troubleshooting, the worse this imbalance would get. After spending over an hour working through the dozens of ECAM messages, the crew had finally gotten to the end of their list. In this time, they had built up a shared mental picture of the damage to their aircraft. All that was left to do now was to land their crippled plane. But there was a problem. They were 50 tons overweight. Even if everything else about the plane was normal, this would be a problem. But the plane was in anything but a normal state. Its braking ability had been seriously hindered by the explosion. The pilots needed a way to calculate whether they could stop on the runway. To do this, they used a feature of the aircraft's onboard information system, known as the Landing Performance Application, to calculate their landing distance. They gave the computer information such as the aircraft's weight, the condition of the runway at Singapore, and they told it which aircraft systems and flight controls were inoperative. The idea was that by telling the computer exactly the condition of their aircraft, it would be able to accurately calculate its stopping distance. But there was another problem. When the pilots entered these variables into the computer, it was unable to calculate the landing distance. It simply wasn't designed to deal with the sheer number of malfunctions the plane was experiencing. But the pilots needed to get some estimate of the landing distance, so they had no choice but to improvise. They experimented with the computer, taking out one failure at a time, starting with the least important ones. Here, teamwork, known in the industry as crew resource management, was essential. Each pilot provided input based on his experience, and together the crew tried to find a combination of variables which they believed accurately reflected the state of the aircraft. They ran the landing calculation a few times, taking out a new problem each time, until finally, the computer gave them an answer. According to the computer, they would need to carry out their approach 35 knots faster than normal, because they were overweight and because the leading edge slats were not working. This would further increase their landing distance. However, they would be able to stop on the runway. The margin for error was razor thin. In fact, on the 4,000 metre long runway, the computer said they would stop with just 130 metres to spare. Anything but the most precise flying by the captain would result in a runway overrun, which would not bode well for the passengers. And even if the crew got everything right, there was still a chance that they would go off the end of the runway. The computer only provided an estimate of their landing distance, and it was an estimate based on an incomplete picture of the damage to the aircraft. Given the very real risk that the aircraft would go off the end of the runway, the captain called the lead flight attendant and told them to prepare the cabin for a runway overrun and subsequent evacuation. The pilots also informed air traffic control that they would need emergency services on landing, and that they had fuel leaking from the left wing. Before turning the aircraft back towards the airport, the pilots wanted to check whether it was controllable. If there were serious issues affecting how the aircraft flew, it would be better to know this now, rather than to find out on final approach. The captain lowered the flaps in increments and tested the controllability of the plane in each configuration down to flaps 3, which they would be using for landing. He found that the plane was controllable, but very sluggish. The loss of some of the wing spoilers had made the aircraft much slower to bank left and right. The crew would need to line up with the runway very far out in order to make a stable approach. They asked air traffic control for this, and they were vectored out for a 20-mile final for runway 20 center at Singapore. The pilots then used the gravity extension handle to lower the gear. After a tense wait, the gear appeared to have extended correctly. The captain then carried out some controllability checks on the aircraft again, to ensure that the plane was still flyable with both the flaps and the gear extended. Again, the plane was sluggish, but flyable. However, with engine number 2 shut down, and with engines 1 and 4 in a degraded mode, it was far from certain whether the speed of the plane would be controllable as it came into land. Frequent changes to engine thrust are a part of every approach, but the captain was reluctant to move the thrust levers for engines 1 and 4, as it wasn't clear whether they would respond correctly. His compromise was to keep engines 1 and 4 at the same thrust setting, and to use engine 3 to control the speed of the plane, as this was the only engine that appeared undamaged. They were now set up for landing, and lined up with the runway. For the passengers, this was a nerve-wracking approach out over the sea. For the pilots, it would be the moment of truth. Were their landing distance calculations correct? Would the plane be controllable on the ground? Would they be able to stop in time? The safety of the nearly 500 people on board depended on the captain's ability to touch down at the right spot and to bring the crippled aircraft to a stop before the end of the runway. The aircraft touched down fast. The captain slammed on the brakes and put engine number 3, the only working engine, into reverse thrust. As the plane continued barreling down the runway, the first officer urged the captain to use maximum manual braking. The captain replied that he was using maximum braking, so the first officer checked this with his own pedals, which were linked to the captain's, and found that they were indeed pushed to their stops. The end of the runway was fast approaching. Gradually, the massive plane began to slow down. By the time it had reached about 60 knots, the crew were confident that it would stop in time. But when it finally came to rest, just 150 metres from the runway's end, there was a new problem. In fact, the passengers and crew were in more danger now than they were at any point during the flight. The left wing was still spewing fuel, which was starting to pool beneath the aircraft. And as it spread out on the ground, it started to get close to the wheels. The pilots could see on their displays that the temperature of the brakes had exceeded 900 degrees Celsius and was rising. if the fuel came into contact with the white-hot brakes, a fire could break out. On top of this, the fire brigade had radioed the crew and warned them that engine number 1, the outboard engine on the left-hand side, was still running. The crew tried everything they could to shut it down, including moving the lever to cut off the engine's fuel supply, but nothing worked. The engine was stuck on high power, all while 3 tons of jet fuel spread out across the runway. The captain was faced with a critical decision. Should he order the passengers to evacuate now, or should he keep them on board, even with the risk of a massive fuel explosion? The flight crew weighed up their options, and decided that at that moment, the safest place for the passengers was on the plane. Outside the aircraft lay thousands of kilograms of fuel and a running jet engine. However, in case a fire erupted, the cabin would need to be evacuated immediately. The captain made a coded announcement on the PA system, telling the cabin crew to prepare for an imminent evacuation. The fire crews began spraying the fuel underneath the aircraft with fire retardant. And finally, 13 minutes after the aircraft had touched down, the flight crew decided that the safest course of action would be to have the passengers disembark via an air stairs on the right-hand side of the aircraft. But because the explosion had destroyed all but one of their radios, which they were using to talk to the fire brigade, they had to use their mobile phones to contact the company to bring their air stairs to the plane. After another 20 or so minutes, this stairs arrived, along with some buses to shuttle the 440 passengers to the terminal. Gradually, the passengers disembarked and were brought back to the airport terminal. The number 1 engine stayed running until 3 hours after landing, when fire crews finally managed to stop it by drowning it with fire retardant foam. Incredibly, after the entire ordeal, not a single passenger or crew member was injured. The flight crew's incredible teamwork and decision-making had led to what has been described by former Royal Air Force helicopter pilot and human factors expert Kerry Edwards as, quote, one of the finest examples of airmanship in the history of aviation. The captain, Richard de Crespigny, was awarded the Order of Australia for his incredible flying and professionalism in an emergency. But what had caused this catastrophic engine failure in the first place? How could a new aircraft with such a spotless record come so close to disaster? The answer, investigators found, was that over time, a pipe in the engine had developed a small crack. As this grew larger, oil had started to leak through it, and onto the engine turbine. On Flight 32, when this oil was exposed to the high temperatures inside the turbine, it ignited. The resulting fire caused heat damage to one of the turbine discs, and as this disc spun as normal, the damage to it meant that it could no longer withstand the rotational forces, and it burst. The sheer speed of this bursting caused the turbine disc fragments to exit the engine casing, in what is known as an uncontained engine failure. This is a rare event, as the engine housing is specifically built to prevent this from happening. It was incredibly fortunate that none of the engine fragments penetrated the passenger cabin, as this could very well have led to loss of life. The root cause of this fault in the oil pipe was a manufacturing defect at Rolls-Royce, the engine's manufacturer. As a result, inspections were carried out on all A380s which had this type of engine, known as the Trent 900 engine. After these inspections, 53 of these engines were removed from service. As a result of this safety improvement, there has not been another incident of this type on the Airbus A380. The aircraft involved in this incident was repaired at a cost of $145 million and is still flying with Qantas today. Finally, as an interesting piece of trivia, when the captain of this flight took a flight home to Sydney a few days after the incident, the engine on that plane failed shortly after takeoff as well, and the flight ended up returning to Singapore too. He ended up being stranded in Singapore for a few more days before finally making his way back to Australia. I'd like to thank the Patreon and YouTube members for helping to make this video possible. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel for as little as €3 per month. I've put the links for that on the screen here. I'd especially like to thank Snowdoggo, Joey and Steve Wilcox for their very generous support. Aviation now has a Discord server, so if you'd like to join a growing community of people discussing all things aviation, just tap on the link in the video description and I'll see you there. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.